Welcome to Critical Thinking Live, the first of our season of short, sharp conversations with influencers, leaders. It's our boutique offering, if you like, to think about what is happening in Europe, but Europe's place in the world. As many of you may have followed this series in January in particular every year, I always have a conversation with Sven Smit, who is the one of the chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute and a senior partner at McKinsey Global. In terms of this particular session and discussion, it comes at a point in time because Sven has written a book with other people, looking at the future, but also through a lens of the past. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you again, Sven. I believe you'll be retiring also from the formal role, but you'll not be out of office, if you like. You will still be involved in working on the subject matters that are dear to your heart, and then we should be the subject of your distinguished career up to this point. My name is Damodra Kanani. I'm Chief Spokesperson and Chief Operating Officer at Friends of Europe, and I'm wishing you a happy new year and a hopeful new year as this book that's come out this week hopes to inspire, because there's a sense of doom and gloom around us, especially when we thought that the Christmas break might bring a break from the cacophony of unpredictability and malice. We've had more and more, and it just gives more at the moment in terms of the sense that someone's been given the most powerful, somebody has been given the keys to the most powerful house in the world and is causing mayhem and chaos. But amongst all of that, we have this book from you, Sven, and in the book, I quote something that you have in the introduction or the preface, that it feels counterintuitive that you're trying to seek out and sense out a sense of hope, and the fact that there are still, despite the adversity around us, there's possibilities that you're in front of us that are just waiting to be grabbed. And I will quote from the preface, which I love the quote that you have from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And your quote is, "The size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them. If your dreams do not scare you, they are not big enough." So, Sven, was it about a big dream you had? Tell us why you wrote this book.
Well, there are many angles at it, and it's an accumulation of our thinking also and our feeling of where we are. But it started with a question that one of our former managing partners of McKinsey asked as we were discussing the last 100 years of our firm and of the world. And he asked the question, what did we actually learn in the past 100 years? And not on everything, but on the stuff that McKinsey Global Institute from an economics perspective learned. And if you go back the past 100 years, you can do it with the statistics and you see a statistic of progress, but you can also do it very personally. Imagine the life of your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your parents, you as a youth in the life of your parents. And I can do this for myself. Every author wrote in the book also their own personal story. And you can only see something that is actually quite difficult. One great-grandfather lived in the Great Depression as was doing basically useless work to stay active. Another one was on the train to the east and was lucky in the war to be able to jump off the train and survive. And that's why I'm here. In the 70s, I was roller skating on the highways of the Netherlands, and I had fun doing that. But my parents' house devalued by 30%, and the interest rates were horrible and all that kind of stuff. And in that same time, I was taking vegetables that we took from a farm, washed them, put them in plastic, and brought them to a communal freezer. Yeah. That's the life that was there in the last 100 years for a middle-class European. You can go to a middle-class Indian, you can go to your story. Remember, all the friends of Europe could do this for themselves. And my daughter, 70 years old, says, when she read the book a little bit, said, Dad, what you're talking about is people live from nostalgia bias. Apparently on TikTok, that's something that goes around. I checked it. It is actually existing. It says you remember the good things of the past, not so much the bad. And as a result, you frame the past as better than today.
Yeah.
So we looked at the lessons of the past 100 years, and you find enormous economic growth, 6 times GDP per capita for the world, much better in certain places than in others, of course. It came from all the economic engines: workers, knowledge, capital, productivity, and so on and so on and so on. And so then we said, okay, now we're done because we fulfilled the question. And I said, no, we're not done. We're now going to look forward. And then we asked ourselves the question, imagine a country where basically people are happy, they think the future could still be good, that the energy is relatively clean already, trains run on time, you feel safe. If your daughter is late from a party, you feel the citizens will protect her rather than, it would be dangerous out there. That country you could call Switzerland. You can pick your own favorite country that works roughly. And then we ask the question, could the entire world reach Switzerland in 2100? So not just 100 years back, but also years forward. And why we ended up with calling this a century of plenty, a story of progress for generations to come, is we concluded there's nothing in our way from a technical economic perspective to reach that prosperity. And then we can debate, can we do it? But let's just not say limits to growth or other things that will basically make it impossible to get there. And if you look at most main scenarios that the world is currently contemplating, whether it's IMF, IPCC, they're building around stories that lead to a 3 times economy in 2100. If you, however, bring everybody to Switzerland, including Burundi, Africa, in total, India, Latam, and so on, and you still have progress in the world that is already a little ahead, you're talking an 8.5 times economy. And then quite a lot of debate changes if you start to believe that's possible, because then you need to start building, then you need to start doing, then you need to start to build a very different energy mix. You have to look at the materials that we need and go for it. And so our point is, as we look to the past and said, basically, why can't we do it again? Hope there's a lot of nostalgia bias in 2100. And that's because it was plenty again.
I'm really pleased you made the point that technically, this is a technical issue, that technically that is possible, because then there's everything else. Because those listeners and viewers will see this as being tone deaf to the context that we're living through at the moment. That actually, when you talk about the world of plenty, and then we could grow 8.5 times our global economy when we're concerned about climate change and all the rest of it. Say a little bit about what, from your point of view, therefore, that in terms of technical economic spreadsheet or looking at the possibilities available to us, this is right, this is possible. What needs to shift then?
It's a very good point. First of all, you have to imagine the dream that you quoted from the beginning. Because if you don't dream, you're not going to build it, and then you're just going to restrict and be in a divide and conquer place. But we need a lot more energy. We went 10 times energy over the last 100 years. Since we are a more mature economy on aggregate, we only need 3 times energy. But then you're not in a 1-for-1 oil and gas versus renewables. You actually need 3 times, and you need the oil and gas for all kinds of other stuff. And that means we need to build a completely different energy system. It might be a race between solar and batteries and nuclear and so on, but it's possible. And, which nuclear it will be, innovation will tell us which balance between solar energy and nuclear for the marginal 2 times it will be, we will learn. If you then look at, do we have the materials, copper, zinc, nickel, cobalt, whatever it might be, the water, the agricultural productivity, and so on, you can see that that's possible. And then, of course, you get the question, but wait a minute, what about environment and climate change? Well, there are 2 points, and one of them we've discussed on an earlier conversation with you before, Adamander, is the first one is, if the economy is bigger, you can pay for it all. And my personal story is the Rhine was not clean when I was young. We couldn't swim in it. There was cadmium, God knows what was in there. And then we got rich, and then we cleaned it up. And that's still the process that we do in the world. I don't like the sequence, but it's hard to force people that don't have money to do something that they are not able to pay for. But the second point that we notice, if you go from a 1-for-1 the story about energy to it, we need 3 times, 12 times the electrons, 20 times the carbon free that we are in today. You basically only have one set of options, which is everything else than oil and gas, because there is no oil and gas to do with 2 and 3 times. And all of a sudden, instead of having a replacement discussion, you have a scaling discussion, which is the race for electrons that we're in. And what we look at, if you take this to temperature, as people forecast this, the bad case is it keeps going up. 2050, we're heading 2.2, 2.6. There's something called a sustainable transformation that's being discussed, where we still go up, but there's a bending of the curve. But that's with 3 times economy. If you do 8 times economy, and you bend the curve, there's no marginal CO2 anymore, because there's no marginal oil and gas anymore. You will do it with something else. So that's possible too. And you'll be in a world with more money that can pay for the good stuff. Now, then the AI and robots will need to do productivity. Now, if all the productivity that we need, which is not that much actually, not that much acceleration to get it in 8 times, because compounded interest over 75 years works so well, we just need a little bit of the AI and robots that we say. And if everything we talk about robots and AI is wrong, it's much harder to get there. But, if even 50% of it is right, we will get there.
So let's turn our attention to Europe. I like what you say in the sense that you need to be able to dream and dream big. Otherwise, you become a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure if you only think about doing good, which you reference quite clearly in the book. Imagine what you would like from the let's dream about Europe together. What would you want in terms of the kind of governance? Because you say governance and making choices are almost critical in this dream, if you like. What should Europe behave like, feel like, if we were to dream about how it gets to this, let's say, this world of plenty?
That's a good question. So let's do it in steps, and I'll make a few smaller steps and then a bigger one. The smallest step that I would love to see is that something of an echo around the book that is emerging in some places. But let me just take it from a quote from one person who said, could I share this book with my team, which is normal for leadership to share an idea, but can I share it with my children? And of course, why would you ask? And then they actually shared it with the children over Christmas, and they were debating the issue. The first step is that society will have a conversation on possibility and not on dividing a pie that feels constrained or limited. Once you have a conversation on possibility, then your minds open up to innovation. I remember, my own first time I watched the moon landing with my dad. I was 3 years old. I remember being dragged down to a black and white television, and then a color TV came. And I think our mindset was bigger, faster, and so on. It doesn't need to be exactly that, but should the mindset be, what are we building? When is the first road? And so that's the conversation. That's the first. If you believe that conversation includes this possibility as possible, then you can start shifting the thing to growth is good. You should accept that it's going to solve problems rather than create problems, even though some problems create that you need to solve even better. And then the third, you need to say, we need to move to building. And building is projects, because you don't build 26,000 power plants that will be needed to get the energy that you need for 2100 by not building. You build them by one. And the pace we need is France in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, which is big, but not as big as China. It's doable. Yeah. So now I'd like to see the first power plant to be built at that pace, and then the second, and the third, because we can talk about the grand Europe, but let's talk about the Europe, and that can be done. And if you look across the world, things are happening, and we can also say in Europe where things work. We did get a good music platform. We have a great semiconductor equipment company. We have some pharma companies that do miraculous things, and we can do also. We have some governments that are mostly digital and so on. Can we do more of these projects that people say, I'd like one of those? And then that scales. That doesn't mean that the total system needs to modernize, get faster, everything we discussed with Friends of Europe before on European competitiveness. All of that needs to happen too, and more. But I hope always that there is something at the project level that can start demonstrating it can be done in Europe. And then people say, we want more of that. And you see it everywhere. People say, Texas is Republican, but there's a lot of solar going on. House prices are down because people are building houses. So it can be done. There will be. So I think even for Friends of Europe, I would say, while we need to discuss all the issues, can we also celebrate the things that work? Because I do believe the positive frame doesn't come from only solving issues. The positive frame comes from the imagination of the dream that you described, that you then work towards.
That's why your book comes at a really poignant and important time politically. You may not have planned it because you didn't know what was in the national security strategy of the United States when it was launched in December. But, what you're setting out is a total antithesis to the future American strategy for security, which has a very much a critical view of Europe and its progress, is very critical of a value-based, human rights, human-centric approach to progress, and is much more of a selfish dimension, if you like, to country-level achievement, economically, socially, politically. So your book comes at a very interesting time against that strategy that's been set out. Say a little bit, would you, Sven, so we've dreamt about Europe and what Europe can do. We'll come back at the end of this conversation about who needs to lead that conversation, but also the art of the possible, but celebrating success, but identifying scalable unicorns or dreamlike projects that can actually come to life. But say a little bit about the geopolitical dimension of this dreaming in terms of where we find ourselves right now. What kind of dreaming should we be engaged in that doesn't look like the black hole that's coming from transatlantic?
Yeah, so we live in complicated times. I would first do the same thing that we did for the plenty with history. Let's go back 100 years. And I would say, yeah, it's a big hole or it's complicated. I'm not sure it's bigger than what we had. We did this progress in leaps and bounds through 3 eras that we discussed at an earlier podcast, from the post-war boom to the era of contention with the oil and a good collaboration model that we then had. And then it broke down and then we rebuilt it to new conditions. I do believe there's some fundamental things that we discussed before, like, the dependency in the system is a bit too high, so you need to do something else. Is that a first approach or is it a new collaborative approach? We don't know. We'll have to figure it out. But I have some confidence that if we can build the progress that we did over the last 100 years through very significant geopolitical moments at the scale of the world, with values discussions on top of them, that we can get there. Again, you can sit in a place, Europe, a country, your own business, and say, oh, I'm befuddled by all the complexity of what's happening right now. Let's not do something. The data centers of the future, the AI of the future, the robots of the future, the self-driving cars of the future, they're all being built right now. Mm. And some of it might be used in geopolitical games or not. But if you're not part of the building, you're not part of the future. And whether that full building will lead to full plenty or it's going to be 6 times instead of 8.5 times, but it's way more than 3 times. That's, I think, the debate that we should have. And the question is, are you participating in the future or are you not? And if this were like a debate that the future hasn't started and we all globally had to start, that's a very different thing than it's happening everywhere. And are you participating?
And you make that point quite eloquently in the book that, if we think our times are tough, let's go back to 1925 with the birth of, Mussolini.
Or 40 or 70.
And we still pull through. But I suppose that generation that lived through it is not really with us. And we have a new set of generations that don't have that memory. In the context of what you just said, that actually, despite the adversity we're living through, innovation is hyper, or innovation is taking place all around us. It's just that we're not pulling it together in the way that we might. Say a little bit about that, because in the book you make reference to the fact that one of the key and important levers has to be to harness innovation across sectors. What do you mean by that? Say a little bit about that in terms of also about the role that EU can play in that respect.
Again, there's something at the conversational level, and then we can go conversational across sectors also, and then there's something at the doing level. Let me start with a different way. I talked about kids at the table talking. I was at some universities and talked about this thought when the book wasn't finished, but I used, of course, some of the content. And their answer was, we never hear this story, not even as an option. So forget whether they agreed or not. That's not the point. They just said never. How can you create a consensus conversation across sectors, across a society called Europe or a country, if the option is not on the table? I'm not saying nobody else in the world has talked about this, but it's not pervasive enough that it's a common conversation to say, which are our 2 options, and again, it's different in India. People are building in India, people are building in China. So it's a bit more European, this constraint stuff. But there are constraints in the US too. There are constraints in China and India too. So that's the first bit, I'd say. Then I think the participants in this conversation will have to be business and government. And you can see everything that's scaling, whether it's India, China, the stuff that's happening in the US that is working from a scaling perspective, whether it's the data centers or not, that's not the companies alone. It's always all sides of society coming together. I think the US has decided tech is part of their solution. So that's happening on all sides. They need energy, so they get the energy. But China has decided energy is important, so they do all forms of energy. India has done the same. And I think our energy policy has a slightly different optimum at the moment. And it's not yet fully there for building. But, I do think the turn of that, as we discussed before, has been made in Europe too, that we have to have another option. So it starts to me, is this option on the table? And then you build. Then you can also say, let's take the AI. Yeah, maybe the platforms are in the US, but can we be fast implementers and build the implementation in the Europe way with the European values? So of course we could.
One of the central values of McKinsey is your capability to harness data, analyze it, and project forward, but also the kind of work you do with company CEOs, private sector, and sometimes government also. And so you've got a kind of I suppose, an insight, even if it's just getting a sense of the feel of where people are standing. How, given that context, given who you are, how do you think this book will land with some of those characters in the public sector at the top end, government at the top end, given the circumstances of public debt they are encountering at the moment?
So let me do the landing first and then add the debt dimension. Good points. I think the landings that I've heard so far are also from earlier discussions and so on, is we need something positive to just pull us out. And then we can debate exactly the contours of the positive, and people will have different opinions and colors and shades and all that kind of stuff. But then we're in a different conversation that goes with that. And you get a bit of a notion that governments are also saying we need to get to do something. You and I discussed so many times in European competitiveness that this was 7 years ago was a issue to convince people about. It's now an issue we're convinced of. We have a roadmap. It's about proper execution and so on. And then you can debate debt. I believe that if we are, money is not a problem. If you have growth, money is a huge problem if you don't have growth. Huge problem. And, many people have calculated that if Europe grows at 0.5% sustained for 10 years, all the good stuff that we like, be it our welfare, be it our environment, be it our pension system, our social cohesion model, and all that kind of stuff, won't work. And so to me, there's both a dreaming part, but also a crisis part to this story, which is the dream would help solve the crisis of the debt and the non-financeability and even affordability if you do it in the right way. But not doing the dream will, but the downside of it is actually more of a crisis than just prodding along. And so I know people want to grow it, and then they have to, the whole discussion is more like, how do I get it going?
Yeah.
And so, people know there's chunks of regulation that are being changed in Europe. Is going to take time. How can I, as a company, invest $1 billion in something that's not investable yet? Can you create the bridges at the company level, at the project level, so that there's, and things are happening. Regulatory sandboxes are being used and all kinds of things to create freedoms in which we can operate towards a dream that hopefully will then be inspiration to make that thing bigger. But, that it's an oil tanker. It's going to take time. Even though oil tankers may be an odd concept in this time.
There's a generational thing. But no, you're quite right. But let's move to those two last points. I want to, as we conclude this conversation, there's two issues. Timing. Dreaming is important, but you also need to have a sense of, given the context we're in, the dream can't last a decade. But it has to be catalyzed. It has to catalyze some momentum. So there's something about the timing issue. But then I suppose the flip side of that is, you've been there many, many times in this conversation, but also working with government, private sector. Do you think the penny is dropped within government, especially European Commission, in that bringing a public-private partnership approach is the way to go?
I think everybody knows it's both the public and the private needs to do something. I think what constitutes a public-private partnership is a different question, because a lot of public-private partnership is a money discussion. Most executives I talk about say, don't worry about the money. Let me just build. Give me the permit, not in 12 months or in 12 years. Give it tomorrow. Create the conditions from all the sides that you can imagine to get it done. Then now there will be other things, nobody will build a nuclear fusion reactor that can't work. There, I think deep investments that often also have government support in the R&D to build a next leapfrog are a different thing. Their money needs to blend. But I think we need to separate the two stuff, the places where enabling, factors, partially regulation and so on, can get it going, and the stuff where it's just has always been useful. that the government was participating also in the money and the creation process. And I would simplify it, it's R&D and execution separated, but just be careful that there's the generic term of public-private partnership. It doesn't need to always be an exchange of money.
And you're quite right to pick me up on that. I meant it in the terms that you've identified. How do you bring the private sector in early as a solution machine, but also part of solution making with government, because it has the access of the infrastructure, the sometimes more capability to be able to work on solutions rather than simply be a contractor in a contractual relationship. On timing, let's go back to that. What's your view in terms of people who are listening to this, watching this? What's your sense? What would you want to communicate in terms of the timing for this dream to become alive?
I personally believe that in about 40% of the world, this is already being staged. In other places, I would say the governance needs to, will Africa get there? Africa can. It has the resources, it has the people, it even has the beginning of the education system coming along and all that kind of stuff. Will all the governance pieces in all these countries be becoming pro-investment in the right way on time is an interesting question. But every country that's starts to see signs that it can work there too. I just saw a huge airport being built in Ethiopia that I said, well, wait a minute, I would have normally expected that in the Middle East. How does that work? I'm still trying to figure out, but you see what I mean? I think in these projects, if somebody's starting to build something that's like, well, wait a minute, how can that come from there? It opens up the eye to get there. And, then I think India, China are still building, the US is building, parts of Latin are building and parts are not. And Europe, some places and some spots it's happening. And so it's more the spreading than it's happening nowhere, which to me is helpful because that means because the world is much easier to transact. Hey, how come these guys got the data center done? Okay, we better get it organized to get it done too. Yeah. So again, this is because the future is already nuclear or fusion or whatever it might be is also being done. Solar and batteries are being done. We can look at the cost curve and can see it happening. Desalination is getting cheaper, should solve water for some people. So you can just look at all these progress curves and say, okay, stuff is happening. And that technological frontier is only expanding. And so the timing is now. What investment in what country will be the right one will also depend on the enabling factors.
Indeed. So, as a parting shot, if you like, Sven, you had the freedom now to say what you want, even though this is an MGI platform, if you like an interview with you. Well, it's not a one message, but what's your messaging to the EU right now as it currently stands? You and I have talked about this before in terms of the inability to create an innovation mentality, inability to cut across silos. Does it need to create the department or the director general for innovation? And they will say they already have it, but it's just not agile enough. What are some of your parting messages to a body that's caught at a time of history where what it does now is going to be very significant to world politics, but also balance in the world economy and balance in terms of values?
So I think there are two stories. There's two things. Mm-hmm. You cannot frame a story in a competitiveness issue only. You have to add a dream that says Europe is beautiful. We want way more of it. And now I don't mean EU. I mean food, culture, values, people. And there's lots of stuff in Europe, by the way, that's not perfect, and we want way less, but that's part of the improvement. And you got to have, if you don't say what the positive is that you're going to do, you're only dealing with issues. And then I think in the enabling front, you need to feel a shockwave of change. And if Draghi says electricity prices need to come down 3 times, okay, what date is it one time based on when? When can I open up my new factory based on 1/3 reduction the price, knowing that it will still go down another 1/3? So get stuff on the ground moving. Energy is a very important one to this. Electrons within energy, even more important. Get in the way or out of the way of getting that done. And it's probably both. Getting in the way and out of the way to get some of these big things done. And then let the small stuff go for a while. Yeah, because then once people have the confidence that we can get one or two of big things done, that's illustrated by 10, 20 great projects that might look like a cathedral but a beautiful one and modern. But let's say the modern cathedral, then I think life will switch on in Europe and say it's possible. But you have to show the possibility, not additional layers of regulation.
But do you believe there's a tendency to be able to move to a more interventionist EU, a more enterprising EU? Because that's what you're describing.
It's an interesting question whether it's more enterprising or interventionist. It might also be giving some freedoms. I actually think a lot of what we have in Europe are the initial 4 freedoms or 4 principles. And I think a lot of what Europe does on that actually is where you get the scale, everything that also is described so it's both. Of course, there's standardization, which reduces freedom to some degree, but it creates scale. But that scale, then that's in a way a new freedom because you have a new. But it has to be in a benefit frame, and it's in places that might be stepping back.
Excellent. Sven, thank you very much for your time. I shall miss these conversations with you.
We can do it again. I'm not going. No worries.
Exactly. You're right. We can do this again. But,
the mind doesn't go with a title.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. But I have to say that, you couldn't have planned such an intervention in a more timely manner. Given what has happened over the past 6 weeks, you can imagine how people across the world are feeling. And to come up with a book from the MGI to say, not just about data or intervention, dream better and dream more. Because actually, if you do that, we might see possibilities that we've not seen within us. So thank you, Sven, for that. And let's hope a lot of people read it. And going back to your point, let's hope it starts conversations in families, communities, regions and nations across the world. Most importantly, the College of Commissioners. And let's see what they might make of being much more interventionist and enterprising. But as you said, Sven, dream more about what Europe could be and better in the future, as opposed to being stuck in aspects. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, colleagues, for listening and watching. Tell us what you think. What is your dream for Europe as well? You can post that to us as well. Thank you very much. Take care, look after yourselves, and look forward to seeing you at our next episode of Critical Thinking Live. Take care. Bye-bye.